absolutely not. I got in the lift, who was charging $50 for a bloody autograph. I got in the lift with Spock, and then little did I know, really, that then Spock and sort of Homer Simpson would become our decision types, and we realised that we're less like, the nudge and behavioural economics agenda suggested that we're actually less like Spock, able to compute everything, and we're more like Homer Simpson in our decision making. So there we are. That's my Leonard Nimoy story.
And actually, the two of you in the lift would have looked a bit like Leonard Nimoy and Homer Simpson.
Not then, Gibbo. 2009. Chiseled.
The Oral Apothecary is sponsored by Jamie Hayes Executive Coaching and OneLessPill.com.
Well, we may well come back to this discussion about information mastery, because I'm sure that we will when we talk later on at the micro discussion. But Dave, I'm not sure if you managed to listen to any of the Oral Apothecary podcasts, but we have these 3 things that we like to ask all of our guests. And the first one is we'd like you to give us and the listener a desert island drug, not something that will save you or others, but something that's a very powerful memory. So Desert Island Discs is about picking the songs that mean the most to the person, not the ones they necessarily like the most. So what would you like to offer?
So I have to tell you, I've put a lot of thought into this and changed my mind at different times. But I'm going to tell you the 2 drugs I actually came up with that both of the histories of those drugs have shaped my career and shaped information mastery, and that's steroids and aspirin. I'm sure you know, so the Cochrane logo, is that meta view of when it was that there was evidence that steroids for preterm labor would help prevent hyaline membrane disease and bronchopulmonary dysplasia and cranial bleeds and stuff. And it's a memorial to when it was that the evidence was there that it was the right thing to do, and the amount of time it was before clinicians actually acted on that evidence. And it's the idea that we won't do that again. And the history of the whole Archie Cochrane's whole motivation was we got to get the information in a place where doctors can find it and use it and their patients can benefit. Definitely, we believe that that's part of it, but we also believe that the other piece of that is that, and this is what we wrote about recently, and we've been really our biggest focus, is that even when clinicians have the right information in front of them, if it doesn't fit with their pathophysiologic thinking, they tend to still ignore that information. So it didn't make sense that steroids could have anything to do with preventing, bleeds in a kid's brain or whether their lungs matured or not. Just didn't make sense. Similarly with aspirin, for a long time, we had evidence that if you were having an acute myocardial infarction, that you should take aspirin. But the reigning theory of pathophysiology at the time when I was still a resident was that a coronary occlusion began when there was hemorrhage underneath a fixed endocardial plaque. So the worst thing you could do would be to give some type of an anticoagulant. So nobody did it, even though the evidence was clearly there. So our big thing is that our educational process imprints, we use the word imprint, like the guy, Conrad Lorenz, that with the little ducklings following him, because when they were born, instead of his mother, he was there and they took him for their mother and followed him around. So our educational process imprints us to prioritize pathophysiologic thinking. And I see it, guys, all the time when I'm practicing. I see clinicians, I give them evidence and they go right back to what they were doing because it just makes sense to them based on their pathophysiology. And I think that's one of the things that Archie kind of missed, was it's not just getting the information there, it's also transforming the way that we think. Going back to information mastery, focusing on patient-oriented evidence and not the disease-oriented evidence.
Yeah, that's fantastic. You can't have aspirin because actually Gimmo has got aspirin. He was the very first person to give his desert island drug. But I love the analogy. But the corticosteroid, for sure, with the Archie Cochrane thing. So yeah, you can definitely have that. For the record, was that dexamethasone, betamethasone, or was it prednisolone, or do you know, or it doesn't matter?
I think it was betamethasone.
Yeah, I got a funny feeling it was too.
Dexamethasone was only invented during COVID, wasn't it, if you listen to the politicians?
All I remember is that they're equipotent, so whenever anybody said they couldn't get betamethasone, I was like, don't worry, you have to have dexamethasone. Okay, well, that's a fantastic choice, Dave, and it fits beautifully with the whole information mastery.
Can I just interrupt? I've just realised, Steve, why guests are coming on and giving us 2 drug choices.
Why is that?
Because it's in the briefing notes that we hand out before the show.
What, you mean people that have read it?
Yeah.
You can tell who's read it and who hasn't.
Okay. All right. Well, for Series 3, we'll amend that. That's my bad, I think is what the kids say.
No blame here.
I'm happy to take the blame. Okay, Dave, what about a career anthem then.
All right, now I got to ask you guys, can I quickly give you two of them?
This isn't in the brief. Go on then, seeing as it's you.
So the first one is Warren Zevon, Werewolves of London. And the reason for that is Alan and I, when we did our workshops, we'd always be pretty nervous. And so I would sing Werewolves of London in the "Ow" part, and then Alan would join in with that. And that would get us kind of laughing and relaxed, and then we would go into our workshops. And one time we were in London, we actually went to, I forget where the place is, where the beef chow mein was, but Alan reminded me that's the restaurant that Warren Zevon was singing about. So that's the first one.
Okay.
And then the second more personal one, Jamie said it's okay to be personal. There's a song by the Sandpipers called Guantanamera. And there's a line towards the end of it where the singer says, he says it in Spanish first, and then he translates it, and he says, "With the poor people of this land, I wish to share my fate. The streams of the mountains please me more than the sea." So I heard that when I was like in high school, and I always focused on what that meant. And I think it really struck with me because, first of all, I think it's a big part of why I went into family medicine, because in general practice family medicine, we really work with the whole community. And I always felt like it was important for me to do that. My practice where I am now is very much an underserved population, and I do feel a real calling to that. And then the streams of the mountain goes with the fly fishing. I love, you can go like in the big rivers or you can go in the ocean, but I love climbing up the mountains and going after a small little native brook trout that phylogenetically of their ancestors have been in that same stream since before Christ. So that's my anthem on my life.
Is that Guantanamera? Is that the song?
Yeah, that's very good.
Okay, there you go. I thought that you'd have gone for a jazz thing because I was looking through my slides and I remember you and Alan talking about jazz and how jazz takes the thing of itself. I can't remember what the analogy was that you used in the Information Mastery.
Medicine is clinical jazz, science plus art.
Yeah, it was Dave Brubeck that used, wasn't it? And I have to say that Take 5, it does come on to what Lawrence Brad was saying about the chemistry between B.B. King and U2.
I was the B.B. King, he was the U2.
Yeah. But also, from a medical educationist point of view, you were the first people that I met that used music as an educational tool. And the fact that these boys remember it 15 years later is impressive.
It was really the first kind of shared decision-making, because clinical jazz was, you had the structure of evidence, but you had the improvisation of applying it to the individual patient with all of their circumstances and all of the probabilities. So good jazz has some structure, but it has improvisation. So we always said, good clinical practice is like doing good jazz. And we loved that one with Take 5 because it had that. The piano does the same thing the entire song. It never changes, like 3 or 4 chords. And then the saxophone, Paul Desmond, moves all over the place. And so you had the improv and you got the structure and it held it together. It's nice you remember that.
Yeah. So that will definitely go into the Oral Apothecary Spotify playlist. And the last thing is a book then that has perhaps influenced your career or something you'd like to recommend to our listeners.
So I obviously thought a lot about this one. And it's a book I read about 2 or 3 years ago. And the name of the book is The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion. It's written by a guy named Jonathan Haidt. And essentially, it answered a question that I've had for years is how is it that people can be so different how they see things? The pandemic is a perfect example of the whole issue about wearing masks or not. And the premise of the book is that there's 6 moral pillars that we all would agree are things that are important pieces of morality. Caring about people, fairness, personal freedom, loyalty, respect for authority, and then sanctity. And that what happens is that almost genetically, or to some extent, probably there's some nurture that's involved, but we sort of align stronger with certain moral pillars. So the United States, the anti-vaxxers, the anti-maskers, to them it's all about personal freedom. That's their strongest moral pillar. Many of us, it's more, I think you guys have it a lot more over in Europe than we do here in the US, but it's that idea of fairness and caring for others, and that has a higher moral weight than personal freedom. So it's okay, I'll go ahead and wear that mask or have that vaccine, but at least help me understand why it is that good people can actually do things that don't make sense to me. I think they're nuts, but it was a great book to help me at least feel better about my fellow mankind.
I'm quite interested in reading that because, you see that, you may be aware of some of it, but not all of it, but you've seen it in this country with the Brexit debate, haven't you? You've had people completely polarised and all good people on different sides of an argument. And then the other one is, as someone who spends far too much time on social media, you see some of this sort of partisan debate being played out on social media, and some of the people, but some of the sort of arguments they're making and the way that they seem to almost hate the people on the other side. It doesn't make any sense, does it?
That's one of the nice things he says in the book is that what we need to realize is that where we have less skill with certain moralities, they are better in the ones that we're not so good at. And we need each other. We need to be reaching across the aisle, like Parliament. We need to reach across because what they have a little too much of what they have, and we have a little bit too much of what we have, and we each need to share it with each other. And it's a great book, Paul. The Brexit thing is a perfect example. I remember when reading about that in the news and thinking, oh, wow, that's a perfect example that Jonathan would be writing about that one. Paul, you writing it down there?
I have got it down, yeah. Jonathan Haidt?
Yeah, H-A-I-D-T. Yeah, he was actually a professor of psychology at University of Virginia when I was there. If you're really liberal, it might be a little tough for you because one of the things he says is that conservatives are actually a little more balanced than liberals are. They're pretty strong on the caring and the fairness and we care about personal liberties and loyalty and respect for authority, but they're more balanced across.
Well, that's what I see in observing it, is it tends to be the people more traditionally to the right who are coming up with the balanced arguments, whereas the left seemingly are more and more of the almost hysterical arguments about stuff, even though I tend to agree with what they're saying more.
The problem is when you have too much loyalty and you stick with a president who clearly is not presidential, but you stay there because of the loyalty or whatever. Too much of that's not a good thing, but too much of the caring and fairness is not so good either. Sometimes your kids don't grow up very well if you don't let them make mistakes, and caring about them means sometimes you got to just let them mess up. And it's not easy to do, but you got to do that.
Okay, well, it does sound like a great read. So it's The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt, I think you said.
That's correct.
Yeah, okay, great. Thank you, Dave.
Our micro discussion next: reducing overuse by recognise the unintended harms of good intentions, published by Professor David Slawson and Professor Alan Shaughnessy. See what we've done here? Only gone and invited the authors on. So we liked the piece so much that we invited them on. Dave, do you want to let us know your thoughts, the 5 unintended harms that you've gone with?
Yeah, Jamie, so this really came out of that workshop we went to in Copenhagen on the International Conference on Reducing Overdiagnosis. And we were sitting there watching. This is like a 4-day conference, and there were 400 people from, I think they said, like 40 or 50 different countries. And Paul Glasgow was there, and a lot of famous people that were really big in the world of overdiagnosis. And it struck me that they were constantly talking about different forms of overdiagnosis, like thyroid cancer or mammography, certain ages, or screening for diabetes or whatever. And it struck me that they kept talking about the same problem, which was these were individual problems. And I suddenly had this vision. I don't know if you remember when we did Information Mastery, we used metaphors a lot. And I had this vision that I actually drew it for Alan right while we were sitting there. And it was a tree. It was the tree of overdiagnosis, tree of overuse. And each of the branches had, continuous glucose monitoring for type 2 diabetics, or titrating statins based on LDL levels, and things like that are clear overdiagnosis, overuse, overtreatment kinds of things. And the roots of the tree, we call it the Flexnerian pathophysiologic thinking process. And over to the side was a smaller tree that it couldn't get any sun because all of the branches of the overdiagnosis tree were blocking out the sun, and it couldn't get any water because the roots were getting it. But it was the tree of health equity, and it was struggling to grow. And the whole concept was clinicians care about health equity and they care about their patients, but what they don't realize is that their overdiagnosis, their overtreatment is crowding that out, and it's rooted in the way they're educated. You can keep chopping off the branches, but they just keep growing back. And so we really needed to go after the roots, the pathophysiologic thinking. So that paper was all about really helping people to see that. We talk about in medicine, the moral reflex, comes from babies when you drop their head back and they throw their hands up. But doctors, when we tell them the evidence, if you really look at it, we probably do more harm than good for screening for diabetes. And they do the moral reflex. That's impossible. But then we go through the process of thinking about it, the information mastery process. And there were a number of different ones in there, mammography and different ones. But it was all about trying to get clinicians to see this viewpoint that things that they were doing that they thought were helping their patients, even though it was intended to do good, it really was overuse and it caused harm. It's kind of the number one nosocomial intervention in medicine today is overuse and overdiagnosis. And why it's so hard to get at it is because it's rooted in the belief that we're doing things that are good for patients. And that's why, again, it requires what we talked about at the beginning, is a whole transformational new way of learning and looking and thinking. And we kind of call it the third wave of healthcare reform, which is really changing the way that we make decisions and how we think. I know I said a lot there, but that's really what it was about and why we wrote that.
I really liked it. And, there's a couple of lines lines in there, but from the start of clinical training, learners must learn to appreciate it's not enough to consider only the effects of our medical care on the patient in front of us. We also have to understand the ripples that can extend from the patient through families or social circles. And I think that's good because it's a slightly different take on the overdiagnosis, which you've summed up really nicely, is we sort of tend to focus on, too much of a certain drug or too much of this and that. You're also looking at the unintended consequences of too much care. And I think you had an example of a couple who have a car crash as a result of being in the car on the way to an appointment that they probably didn't need. And that could be seen